Have you ever thought about how comfort is not just a feeling, but also a form? What does it mean to create comfort when it hasn't always existed around you? I'm Jo Wright, the creative director at Take Two, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Gundungurra people, the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking from today. Luke Haynes is an architect-turned-quilter whose work hangs in galleries, wraps buildings, and pushes the boundaries of what textile art can be. Raised across 15 states, often without stability, Luke taught himself to sew as a teenager. Art and creative problem solving became his curriculum for identity and radical survival. Today he's known in the quilting world for many things: photo-based portrait quilts made from second-hand clothing, sculptural installations, and a long-running affirmation quilts project with his wife Nicole Leff, a mental health activist and artist. These quilts are soft declarations designed to hold space for hope. And what a good time it is for some positive affirmations, right? In this episode, we'll talk about all of that, plus the double meaning of comfort, both emotional and physical. Quilts are Luke's medium and his message. As he says, people who don't know quilts can still talk about them. Well, Luke and I do know quilts, and for the next hour or so, we're definitely going to talk about them. Let's dive in. Hi, Luke. How are you?
Really great. That was an awesome intro. Can I use it?
Of course you can. It's all you, really.
Yeah, but you made me sound fancy, so I appreciate it.
Well, I used my fancy voice, so.
You nailed it.
Thank you. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderfully. Thank you. And yourself?
Good. I'm really good. Really happy to be here. Thank you. We have people joining us live. So please, if you can say hello in the chat and pop a note where you're tuning in from, we'd love to hear from you, and maybe even say a couple of hellos as they trickle in. But like I said, Luke, I'm so thrilled to be chatting with you today. Thanks for your time.
Of course.
What have you been working on today? What's been happening?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm working on this massive project for the city of Phoenix in Arizona. And so today I've actually just been cleaning up because I'm making about 100 quilts for this project. And that starts to get drifts nearly as tall as me. So I have to kind of find the floor occasionally. And so we're getting near to delivery. I've actually found sections of my studio that I wasn't sure were still there. So really nothing glamorous besides folding for, probably a week straight.
Sounds cathartic.
Yeah, kind of, yeah, actually.
Yeah. The cleanup, ready to move on. Well, is that going to be it, or do you have a lot more to do? You said something about binding, I think, before.
Oh, yeah. Well, I have to bind them all. That's my least favorite part. So you leave it for the last. It's sort of the broccoli on the edge of the plate.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it makes each one finished, and then what happens? They all go to Phoenix, and
we drive them to Phoenix, and then install them on this 85-foot long tunnel out in a city park to create this sort of shade environment.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Denny, we did a call out for some questions before this interview, and Denny did say, "How's the Phoenix project coming along?" So thanks for the update.
Yeah, coming along slowly though. Making 100 quilts is a lot of surface area. It's about 1,000 pounds of material has gone into making that.
Wow. You're going to have to work it out in football fields, right? That's usually the...
Yeah. I don't know what that would divide into, but yeah.
We do have a couple of people who are saying hello. So we've got pictures within. Hello from Joe in Seattle. Hey, Joe. Always nice to meet you.
Seattle. I live there. It's a great spot.
Beautiful. Philippa, hello from Ontario. Thea, hi from Redcliffe, Queensland, Australia. So our neck of the woods. Ursula, hello, Luke and Joe. Beverly, it's midnight for Beverly.
Oh, cozy. Thanks, Beverly.
Okay, well, that's a nice way to chill out, I think. And Diane, hello from New Brunswick in Canada. So welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you join us. Let's kick things off, Luke. And the first question that's always good. Well, actually, before I kick things off, we're coming live on YouTube and Facebook, but we'll also be dropping this episode as a podcast. So if you are listening in podcast format, obviously we're going to be talking about visual things. So make sure you take a look at the show notes. The link will be in the episode description. That way you'll be able to see the beautiful work we're talking about as we go. But for those listeners in particular, a really good way to start is to find out, Luke, how would you describe your work to somebody who's never seen it before, or someone who's tuning in? They might be on a drive, or they might be sort of enjoying the podcast while they're making. How would you describe your work for those listeners?
I don't know why that feels like I'm on the spot. That should be the easiest thing for me to say, but most of my work is a reaction to other work. So to say that I make one thing is not particularly true. I made a bunch of portrait quilts for a long time. I also made a bunch of traditional quilts. I've made large ones, I've made small ones. So to describe my work, I would say it's kind of quilting is my medium that I'm using to have different conversations. So a lot of times you'll see portraits on it because that conversation is about sort of the art world, or in this particular case, sort of the physicality of myself as the maker. But I think the through line is most often trying to sort of challenge the expectation of quilts. So whether it's making a lot of them, or whether it's changing the way that maybe they are presented, or maybe changing what's on top of them.
Yeah. We will look at some images of what you mentioned there, some affirmation quilts and the portraits for sure. And I think it'll be really interesting too in this chat to talk about how you combine the tradition with the portraiture, or with the more contemporary ideas of quilt making. And another question, I don't want you to feel on the spot, but why quilts? Why fabric? Why this particular medium or form in your work?
It's a great question. So I studied art and architecture in university, and kind of came to quilts along the way, but more so even afterwards. For two things. One, I like the actual act of touching it. You know, if you go to a quilt show, everyone's trying to touch them. And so there's something so kind of human to the idea of engaging with fabric as blanket, as clothing, as textile, as environment, as texture. And so there's something very tactily, haptically human in the medium. And so kind of finding that and just sort of engaging with that was really interesting. And the second one is just that I wasn't very good at it at first. Honestly, it was sort of like the first one I made was like, oh no. And so I said, you know, well, as a perfectionist, I guess I wanted to do better. So I had to make another one. And, you know, after that, I think it's just been a series of trying to make better ones, trying to kind of learn the medium. Because as you guys all know, whether you have done it or not, it is a task of love, both in hours and workmanship and skill sets that go into it. So I'm constantly trying to better my skills and self in the making process. So I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like many art forms, really, it's not a quick one. You have to really commit to the quilt to make a quilt. There's so many components of making, and it's not really something you can speed up too much. So I would imagine you're often planning the next one, planning the improvements while you're working on the current one.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, in sort of, you know, of late, the last decade or so, I'm making series of work to have conversations. So it's not just a single one. I'll be making 10 of them at a time, or in this case, 100 of them at a time, to create a bigger narrative, so that somebody who comes to the exhibition will say, okay, well, like it or not, I know what he's doing on purpose, because there's the same thing through a series of work that helps sort of push the narrative. So exactly. Though, you know, if I'm making 10 at a time, I'm kind of working on all of those while conceiving of the next ones.
Well, that's probably a good, well, I've got so many questions, where to begin, but I think it's really interesting to talk about this idea of you doing it en masse or in bulk. And there's a project I have some images of here that are from a decade or so ago, but it's a pretty similar theme because you made 50 log cabins for this exhibition, or this installation rather. I'll just show a few of the images here. So firstly, for those who are not familiar with quilting, would you like to just explain what a log cabin is, and then what you sort of achieve with the project? Yeah.
A log cabin is a traditional quilt block, a repeatable unit. And in my sort of research, it would arguably be the first, or sort of the most traditional repeatable quilt block unit. It wouldn't have been the first quilt by any stretch, by maybe 1,000 years or more, but it was this moment when culturally quilting became something that groups were talking about. It wasn't just, let's combine fabric to make a blanket that's big enough, or to make a tent out of it, etc. It was this moment where there was a group, a subculture that agreed upon an aesthetic and copied it. So the log cabin was this moment where quilting went from individual craft function to a set of language. It is almost the first piece of the alphabet where quilting was written down. It was this moment in quilting that became very important, that allowed quilting to be a language that was shared between individuals, that was further than just blanket, comfort, textile. It was this moment where there was a repeatable unit that could then be slightly altered or changed or shared, or different ways of kind of creating a network, a community of individuals into something larger, which is obviously very metaphorically quilted as well. But so for me, using the log cabin was really important because it was this kind of base language of the medium.
Yeah, I'll show that image again too, because I think, what I'm hearing is that perhaps it's traceably one of the first instances quilting became a design, what am I trying to say? A design as much as a functional object. People,
right? I mean, yeah, it was kind of an agreed upon aesthetic in some ways. You see these movements in art, whether it's chiaroscuro or really, modernism, or just all of these like very different movements. I mean, from Renaissance all the way through modernism, through contemporary, there's these sort of movements in art. And in quilting, the log cabin was kind of the first of the movements in a lot of ways. And that's not to say that that's all that people were doing, or to say that any other block is less important. It's just to say that it was kind of a very distinct line in the sand. And so for those of you who aren't seeing it or off doing something else, I made 50 log cabins, and they were all the same size, all the same colors, but my rule was that each top was different. And so they were all various orientations of the blocks, or sizes of the strips that went into making them, or different ways of combining those blocks to create these different layouts. And so I made 50 different iterations, even though my rules were red centers for every block, black fabric, white fabric, all made from clothing. It took about a ton of clothing, 2,000 pounds of clothing, to make these 50 log cabins. And so making all of them with the same set of rules. They're all 90 inches by 90 inches. They're all quilted horizontally in the white, vertically in the black. And so each one has the same vernacular, but making 50 variations allowed me to understand some of the language implicit in this change of small portion of the medium.
Yeah. You mentioned the red center. And so that's a classic log cabin feature, is the block sort of spirals around, and there's always a red center, which, if I'm right, represents the home. Is that correct?
Well, so not the home itself. So the log cabin is the home. So a log cabin is almost actually built. So it represents the hearth. So the fire in the center, why it's red, and then the logs are basically built around the fire to create the home, encapsulating the sort of cooking, heating, comfort environment.
Yeah, yeah. That's sort of, I'm using that as a handy little segue to loop back to the why quilts question, because I think it's undeniable that quilting has an attachment to domesticity and the home and comfort because of the nature of what it is, or what it might have been traditionally. It was thrown on beds, kept people warm, was originally created out of whatever materials you could find to piece together to create this functional object. And is there something about that, the home or comfort or domesticity, that interests you about quilts? Is that another why quilts answer, or am I sort of taking a detour there?
I mean, for me, I mean, absolutely. So kind of coming from a very changing home growing up and finding myself in a lot of different environments. You kind of think of the binky or your blankie, or, when you're very little, you have this attachment to a comfort object. And so for me, I think there is absolutely something so comforting about, quilts and safety and blankets and that, I mean, I take one now with me when I travel. So there's always, I always have one on the bed at whatever hotel or guest room or whatever I'm staying at. And so there is something of that sort of, usual experience that makes everywhere, at least, I'll at least have a quilt. Like if there's not enough blankets, or if there's too many blankets, or if it's too hot or too cold, at least I know, my datum that I'm starting from. So there's absolutely something from that for me in particular, my own sort of human experience. Absolutely.
I'm exactly the same. I take a quilt. Quilts are the perfect weighted sort of blanket for a summer holiday, I've found. They're they're so lovely to travel with, and that comfort. It really is quite a nice thing, as well as art pieces, as well as functional for the home, for my kids, whatever it is. But I do like to travel with one too. I'm glad to hear I'm not the only one, Luke.
Oh, yeah, I'm often, stacked up against it on the window of an airplane, snoozing my way to wherever we're going.
1,000 uses for a quilt.
Exactly.
Is it also, so you trained in architecture, and a lot of people, when they hear quilts or contend with the notion of making a quilt, they're going to think, oh, precision. That's a very exact kind of craft or hobby. You've got to get your points lined up. You've got to repeat something over and over. Do you think there's a relationship there for you too? I feel like your quilts certainly move in a more free, expressive direction, but quite a lot of the time there is a precise underpinning or a contemporary sort of piece on top of a traditional blocked quilt. Is that an architecture relationship there, the precision?
So one of the, I had a professor once say that if you want to know if it's good architecture, look at the places where different materials touch. So where the floor hits the wall, where the glass hits the edge, where the stone, whatever the material, where the wood hits the stone, the steel hits the concrete, whatever. And so, this idea of being very intentional about the materials interacting doesn't necessarily mean precision, but it does mean intentionality. And so for me, that's very architectural. So I've definitely made quilts that I'm very fastidious about matching my points, because it is about that explanation and that sort of coming from quilts and of quilts and saying this is important. And there's plenty of quilts where that didn't matter as much as maybe an overall message or an overall color or a speed. And so I think that if you look at quilts, any quilt, you can see a lot of what the values of the maker are. The stitching, the piecing, the quilting, the size, the binding, the back, the batting, like what it's made out of, how it's been kept. all of those are indicators of value of the maker. And so I think that, even in my own work, there's quite the range, and you can see each one for its own individual narrative based on what was important for maybe the exhibition.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. The joining of different materials and intentionality. And I can really see that as I think through your work, how you combine different things and ideas. That's where an interesting juncture happens as well.
Yeah.
Let's talk about messaging and messages.
Sure.
I would love to chat to you about your affirmations quilts, which in our introduction I mentioned is a collaborative project with your wife, Nicole. I might show a couple of images here, and as I do, it would be great if you could explain the project a bit, how long it's been running, kind of what you're doing with this particular project. So I'll show some images.
So this is a project that Nicole, my wife, and I have been working on for, oh gosh, she's better at numbers and dates than I am, but we'll call it 5 years. And we've been making these quilts. I make the quilts, she makes the messages. This one says, "Thank you for being in this world today." And this was actually the first one that we left. It was in Green River, Utah. And it was up for 2 days before somebody snagged it. And all of them on the back have a little panel that tells you that you can have it. This one says, "If you find this quilt, you can keep it. It was made by hand with lots of love. You can use it in any way you want, and it can be washed in a washing machine. I hope this gives you a little love today and every day." And so we've made these quilts. Again, Nicole's better at numbers. She argues that we've made 70 of them, and I argue that we've made 30 of them, but she's probably closer at this point. We've left them all over the world, all over the country. Each time we travel, we make them and leave them in the environment that we are going to. We've been hired to make them for some museums and leave them for their patronage outside. We've been commissioned for spaces, interior, exterior, for groups, for different institutions and different ways of finding output through messaging. But the fun thing, the nice thing, the engaging thing about this is that it is a message that gets to exist in kind of this third space, this public space, kind of like a mural or a mosaic or graffiti or something that is sort of a public art facing form. But each of these is takeable. Each one of them that we've put out has been taken by somebody who now ostensibly, we have no idea or no way to know, uses it. Or, even if it's just, to hold things in their garage, we're not necessarily worried about its sort of artistic value as much as it's folded into people's human experience. And that, I think, is something so valuable about quilts, but also valuable about affirmative language, right? Like, one of the things about these quilts is they are put out publicly and they're free. And so there's no barrier for anyone to receive that affirmative messaging, right? We're not trying to sell anything. Our names are not on them anywhere. So whoever takes it is kind of asking to own that message without having to, there's zero barrier except for maybe taking, the ropes off of whatever we tied it to. So there, then there's no money, there's no information. You don't have to tweet about it. There is no barrier to earning and owning the affirmative messages for this project. And so it's been a really fun thing to see the response and experience and sort of other people finding and engaging both with the projects and with the objects.
Yeah, there was you were in Sydney relatively recently. I live south of Sydney, about 90 minutes away. And you popped one up on a fence overlooking the Opera House.
Yeah.
And I had to actually question myself, like, can I get there? Will I get there in time? But I think it got snaffled very quickly from memory. Have you ever heard from the people? Because you're right, you don't put your name on them. So people are coming across this thing. They're not necessarily a follower, Luke. Right. They're seeing this thing. And have you ever heard from them? Because I just imagine that that moment of discovering them and then seeing it and saying, what, I can take this? That's so, in this day and age, that's so surprising.
Right. We've heard from people who have had connections. So like occasionally a quilter will see that I posted it and go over and get it, which is great and totally fine. And then we've heard from some of that community of people who have a social media connection to kind of sharing that they've accepted the object into their experience, which is great. But outside of that, I mean, we've never heard from anybody who hasn't had a connection to, like, who sort of found us later. It's,
Yeah.
you know, it's either been people we've known before, or it kind of goes off into the mysterious ether of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. We've had a question come in actually from Pictures Within. Are the affirmation quilts a locative art form? I guess I'm asking about whether hunting for the perfect place to put them is part of your process, Luke.
I mean, absolutely, right? So like putting it overlooking the Sydney Opera House and, you know, finding these environments from mountainsides to iconic architecture to vistas. I mean, part of it for me is I want to take a pretty picture of it. So I want it to go up somewhere nice, but it's also about sort of signing the world in washable paint. You know, we put these objects up in these places that we get to experience, and we're lucky enough to be in Sydney and Taos and Phoenix and New York and LA and, you know, Mexico and wherever, Canada, France, you know, all of these different places. And we get to sort of like sign our experience by putting a quilt, but it's not permanent. It just kind of goes away, you know, sort of signing it in chalk so that it gets washed away. So the location is very important, albeit ephemeral. You know, it's sort of these backlog of, you know, I'll look back on it and say, wow, that was such a beautiful experience, you know, looking at the Sydney Opera House, and we went to a show there, etc. So it is a very personal experience of finding the location, because it's part of my actual experience. It is a way to sort of locate myself in the world, or leave a trail of my human existence behind, albeit very short-lived sometimes.
Temporary. It's like temporary positive activism or guerrilla art. It's I remember seeing them in your feed, and we will link to Luke's Instagram and the Affirmations Instagram as well in our show notes. I remember seeing them for the first time and just thinking, what? Having experienced the making of a quilt, like, what? But it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
It's been really rewarding in so many ways. There's also been plenty of people who thought that it was a fun idea and have done it themselves. There's been people all over the world as well making their own quilts, some with messages, some without, and leaving them with notes as gifts to the world. I mean, quilting has such a rich history of gifting and making and sharing and comfort, be it quilts of valor, where there's sort of quilts for service people, to quilts at houses for people who are transitioning out of bad circumstances, to grandmas making quilts for grandchildren because it's cozy, or, you know, and everything in between. And so there's such a beautiful history of the object as kind of gifts and sharing, that it's a fun thing for us to see other people take this idea and do it themselves. You know, there's less historical precedent for people just putting them on a park bench, but I think that's still a beautiful way to share quilting with people. One time I saw a person picking one of these quilts up, and she talked to somebody who was near an establishment where she picked it up. I didn't get to talk to her, but I talked to the person who she talked to, and she said, I've never owned a quilt before. I've never owned a quilt before. And it was this moment where she was feeling really tender about this sort of like nostalgia for an experience of having this sort of comfort object that so often represents family and time spent making something. And so, having the story of somebody who sort of inherited a quilt object through this practice was really heartwarming for me.
Yeah, there's a lot of families who have generations of quilters and that real tradition. And I learned how to quilt from my grandparents. But then there's also a lot of families who don't. And so you're offering up the possibility of someone owning this tradition in their own way.
Yeah.
There's a question that's come into the chat, which might indicate a shift of gear for us to talk about another type of quilt that you make, Luke, which is what's she going to show? No, I wouldn't surprise you too much. So this has come in from Philippa. I'm particularly interested in the portrait quilts. I wonder if you could talk about the process of the faces painted on after you have finished the quilt. So let's take a look at some images, and the ones I pulled together have a common theme. They're often self-portraits, Luke. So I guess if we imagine this conversation, we've talked about quilts that you're throwing out into the world to something quite the opposite, quilts that are expressing you literally. I'll show a few images and perhaps you can chat through some of the ideas around this work. Sure. Chronologically, these might be all over the place. We've just put in the ones that sort of seemed on theme. So I'll start with this particular.
Yeah, this is one of my very, very first quilts I made. So self-portrait's very important. Self-portraiture is very important in the canon of art because it is often a place for practice. If somebody hired me to make a portrait of a duchess, it's got to be pretty good. So self-portraiture is a way for artists historically to practice without having to present the final result. And it's also for me kind of a way to showcase my experience over a lifetime of making and, sort of a changing physical self, as well as a changing set of skills. But to answer your question, there's no paint anywhere in any of these. They're all bits of fabric. It's all fabric put together to create these portraits. And depending on the portrait, sometimes the quilt has been pieced together and sometimes it's been raw edged, appliqued together. So it's kind of like painting, but with fabric, but just on top and sort of creating these different layers. So it really depends on which piece it is and what story I'm trying to tell with the actual piece itself.
We touched on how long it takes to make a quilt. And I'm interested in the idea of how long it takes to make a self-portrait quilt and how long you're spending with your own image in that process. I guess it would be the same thing if it was an oil painting that takes layers and layers and months to make. And is there a process that happens, a relationship between you and your image as you're making a self-portrait quilt, or does it just become abstract because by then you're just looking at the tone and the shapes and the technique?
I mean, it's got to be very different for a portrait painter, an oil painter, because I'm working on a small portion of this. I never see the whole thing until it's nearly done. So I'm very rarely staring into my own, likeness and sort of giving me the the finality of the universe. It's just like, I got to put these 700 triangles together and then, put this other bit on top of it. So it's at the beginning with the design process, there is some of that, but that is significantly shorter time-wise than the actual manufacture. And at that point, you're looking at a portion of it. I mean, honestly, I've tried to do time-lapse videos of making quilts, and they're the most boring videos in the world. I mean, I would rather paint dry, just because you're seeing someone hunched over a sewing machine for hundreds of hours, and then all of a sudden they go, and it's done.
Yeah.
It's sort of like there's very little in between where you're like assembling it. There's a lot of that, but it's not particularly interactive. I'm not sort of looking at my changing self as a human. It's sort of like, oh, okay, I've got to get the shading on this shoulder right. So yeah. It's a good question, but in the case of sort of quilting, it's so bifurcated into these components, and I'm just sort of working on a piece at a time before I look back and, I'm like, oh, I did it great, or whoops.
Oops, that doesn't
Yeah.
look like me.
Yeah.
Is there a idea about these documenting? So you're removed from the image of yourself as you're making them, but over time you have a body of work, which is self-portraits.
Yeah.
Is that like a diary sort of exploration, or is there an idea about your intention with making images?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just the diary of human experience. And particularly it being the same medium, I mean, my skill sets have changed and my interests have changed, and some of them took me hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, and some of them took me a weekend, and that really depends on what I'm interested in. And so you can kind of look back at the objects and the images and see, as to the conversation we were talking about before, you can see the intentionality of the maker, in this case me, about what's important. And sometimes it's the material engagement, and sometimes it's just a sketch, a big picture, as it were. But it is exactly that, a diary of sort of both the experience of making as well as the physicality of changing.
Yeah. I wanted to show this one again because there's a few of your works where you're really playing with perspective. So when you look at the quilt front, what we're looking at here is an image of the quilt front on, where Luke's sort of head and shoulders are stretched quite horizontally. And then there's an image next to it that when you look at the quilt on an angle, the portrait is in the sort of correct, so-called correct perspective. And I was wondering what you're playing with here around perception or the experience of looking at a quilt.
Sure. So this was actually purpose built. This one was asked for by the American Folk Art Museum in New York. So this one had a home as it was being constructed, and I knew the space that it was going to be unveiled in was this kind of narrow space. So it was, quilts are big, quilts are massive, and so there wasn't going to be the opportunity to step back really, really far from this, but I wanted there to be a way to engage it from further. And so by designing it that you can only see the portrait from an angle allowed you to get much further back from the object and still see what the subject matter was. But it's also about this thing that I talk a lot about because I really feel that quilts are sculpture. I think that there is another dimension to quilts than a lot of other sort of wall art medium. And I think that by asking people to take multiple vantage points around an object, you are helping to kind of explain its sculpturalness. And so in the case of these perspectival quilts, you're asking someone to look at it from the side and see the image. But if you've met any quilters, they'll also get up close and look at your points and your stitching and your binding and your fabric and your method and all of that, because they want to know and it's interesting. And so by asking somebody to look at it from multiple vantage points, you're kind of proving its sculpturalness inherently with the object and its methodology.
Yeah, there's a couple of, it's interesting, there's a couple of these self-portraits that require the viewer to step back or step into them, step towards them in a certain way and explore them, which is not necessarily getting up really close and inspecting the points and the detail. You've kind of created this requirement that to see the quilt, to understand the image and the artwork, you've got to step back and have a look at it from a distance. It's quite interesting. I'm also showing a couple more. This is another, well, it's two quilts, and on the left it's quite a well-known image of the double Elvis, and then on the right is your interpretation, I guess, or your self-portrait version. Yeah. Is this, and I'll show a few more quilts that are portraits of other people or portraits of, identities from history. Is there something about that iconography of imagery that's interesting to you?
Absolutely. I mean, so as a quilter, it's my job to explain why these things are valuable. Like, I literally sell these to keep my lights on, and there is a disconnect with the fiscal value and the emotional value with quilts. I find that globally, people think quilts are interesting and valuable because grandma made them and they're wonderful and they're cozy. But if you say, do you want to buy one? They'll say, sure, here's a tenner. Have a great time. And you're like, well, that took me 1,000 hours. So I can, whatever it is, it's 1/12 of the amount of time I can spend in my entire year. So $10 is not going to feed me and my dog and whatever. And so, my job is kind of presenting the explanation of quilts as having fiscal value as well. And so talking about the world of fine art is a very easy way to say, do you think a painting is valuable? You can also think a quilt is valuable. So taking postures that are very renowned from the capital A art world and reproducing those in quilting sort of nods to saying, okay, Andy Warhol made a silk screen of Elvis and sold it for X number of thousands of dollars. Can I take that posture and make it out of fabric and then talk about the value of it? And so really nodding to some of these kind of values, but also nodding to kind of like pop art in general. Like, pop art was about the revolution of subject matter within the body of work to allow kind of the layman, the everyday human, to engage with it a bit more, right? It's about soup cans, and it's not just about, kings and golden mirrors. And so taking some of the concepts from pop art and saying, it is okay for quilts to be high art, but it is also okay for quilts to be low art, but also interesting, so really finding that knife's edge between fiscally valuable but intrinsically accessible is something that I think is very interesting. So taking pop art, iconography from pop art is a really good way to do that, because you're saying, hey, this is like art, but it is also accessible. And so, there's just a lot of ways of having that conversation built into the object itself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that's really helpful. Thanks, Luke. We've got a question from Philippa. She's just curious how big these particular ones are.
Sure. So the one on the right is a bit smaller. It's probably what are we looking at, about 50 inches wide and about 60 inches tall. And the one on the right is the size that I use almost exclusively, as best I can, is 90 by 90, so 7.5 feet square. That's the size that I make the vast majority of my work, because it's the size that I use on my bed. And I like the idea that every one of these can be swapped out at any point to be used on my bed or taken on travels or whatever. It's the size of the one behind me. It's the size of, most of the, it's the size of all but one of the self-portraits. There was one that I made 87 instead of 90 inches because that was the max for a quilt show. And that's back when I put quilts in quilt shows. And so I made it a little smaller so that I could enter it into a show. But all the way, anyway, the other ones are 90 by 90 because I find that to be proving that they're real in a way, because it can actually go and has actually gone onto a bed for function.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of quilters, perhaps lots of makers, but I know quilts, so I'll speak to that, is they find a comfortable size and it's the one that sits right. And that might be just as much the function of throwing it on a bed. It might be related to the size of their sewing machine. It might be their physical ability to wrangle something big or small. The financial aspect of how much fabric they can afford to invest for a quilt, all of that kind of thing comes into play. It seems like there's a natural landing point that happens for a lot of quilters that's a comfortable size. A semi-related question from Denny is around the planning of your quilts and how do you get to your ideas? Do they just come to you? Do you brainstorm? We've talked about how you're probably planning the next one while you're still making the other 50.
It's a great, it's a good question. How does anybody get any ideas? Like when someone says, what do you want for dinner? Why are you, oh, I want sushi, or I want, whatever, I want a salad, how does any of these ideas come from? It's a mixture of precedent experience and, novel interest, right? So like for me, there's something about wanting to continue a conversation that I've had before. For example, the self-portrait, that conversation isn't over, but the novelty of trying a new methodology is also very interesting. So trying a new system for making an old project. So somewhere between there, a lot of the time for me, I will have something that I will want to talk about, scale or material or value or narrative or gender or sculpture. And then I will make a body of work of that, 10 pieces, 15 pieces, 50 pieces, 100 pieces, depending on the project. To have this conversation, because one of my goals is that the object itself does a lot of the work for me. I would love someone to come and see a thing I've made and get a lot of what I'm trying to present out of it without me having to stand by all of them and say, this is a quilt. Here's why it's important. Here's why there's money. Here's why it's cool. Here's why I'm cool. Here's why, all of that stuff, which I hope, I don't need everyone to get everything, but, my goal is that through these bodies of works, I'm creating these narratives and also learning how to add them into each project. So, the idea often is a continuation of something that came from the last project. Maybe it was unclear, or maybe the question that came up a lot from the last series, or just in my life in general, lent itself to being answered with a body of work.
Yeah. Because it was Denny's question and Denny had asked how the Phoenix project was going, what's the story you're telling there, Luke, with that project?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the project I'm doing right now is this 85-foot long shade tunnel, City of Phoenix. And City of Phoenix gets really hot, 116 Fahrenheit in the summer days, like really, really, like actually dangerously hot. And so the city has teamed up with me to create a novel experience in a city park talking about shade. But I proposed it because I was doing similar projects already about quilts in outside environments. For me, it's about quilt as architecture. Again, I'm talking a lot about quilts as sculpture in lectures, in work, and in presenting, and sort of the things that I'm doing. And so quilts as sculpture, quilts as architecture is a lot of the same narrative. So creating environments out of fabric really sort of pushes the scale for someone to not only just put it around you, but also be covered by it, to inhabit the experience that it creates as an installation. And so this one is about pushing a bit more into the experience of engaging with fabric. Just even the simplest sort of like blanket fort when you were a child, putting a sheet over a table and climbing underneath it had a different experience than just being under the table, or, putting some couch cushions around and sort of blocking a space and, playing with dolls or Legos or whatever it was, gave you an experience of comfort and cozy and safety and privacy and nuance and novelty. And so pushing that to some of these larger scales allows, I think, this experience of quilting, fabric, and tactile engagement with, fiber to a different scale. It just allows us to have an engagement with it on a way that is maybe a bit unexpected.
Yeah. Yeah, there's the scale, and it's similar to the work 10 years ago. It strikes me, the scale and it's not just a quilt on a wall. So that's when we're experiencing a quilt on a wall in an exhibition space, but it's different if they're strung up and you have to walk around and through them, or you have to walk under them. And I think that would tie into people's core memories of being under things or inside things. And it seems so joyful, that kind of experience of quilts, even if it's sort of like making 100 of them and now I've got to buy them and all of that. But at the end of the day, whether it's a quilt for a bed or a quilt for a wall to enjoy, or a huge installation of 100 quilts, tactility and enjoyment, comfort that comes from them.
Right.
Do you find comfort?
Yeah, and
Sorry.
hopefully nobody comes in thinking about me having to bind them all. Hopefully every viewer comes in and just has the experience that I want to create, and they haven't seen my gray hairs from having to sit there.
Yeah, it's the messy middle, right? No one sees the messy middle of projects where it's like scraps and poked fingers and all the
Exactly.
Yeah, fantastic. When's that one being installed, Luke? I'm really looking forward to seeing images of
The first week of June is the installation. So the opening event is June 7th in Phoenix.
Oh wow, okay, so we're in the hot months of Phoenix weather there.
Yeah.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing those images from our other end of the world where it's going to be the middle of winter.
Yeah.
I feel like we could talk all day, and I'm enjoying this so much, Luke. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, of course.
When we're coming to the end of these interviews, we like to do a little segment of rapid fire questions called Every Artist Must. So the way it works is we'll begin a sentence and you finish the sentence with whatever comes to mind spontaneously. So in this instance, I'll say every artist must something, and you finish the sentence off, and so you can take your time.
So not rapid fire, but yeah.
Rapid fire, but in a chill way.
Okay, good.
So are you game for every artist?
Of course.
Okay, let's go. So every artist must own.
Wow. Every artist must own, I would say art.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to expand on this, or are we just going question?
It's your round, Luke.
I just think that every responsible artist doesn't live in a vacuum, and so understanding what other makers have made, be it historically or contemporarily, allows a person to make their best work. So I think every artist must own art to be the best version of themselves.
I love that. Thank you. Every artist must create.
I'm just going to put a period at the end of that. Every artist must create. I just think it's true. I just think that, I'm such a big advocate for studio practice. And, all of my students say, oh, I really want to perfect this XYZ technique. And I say, okay, go make 100 of them. And then on the 101st, you will be doing it on purpose and you will know what you're doing. And the 100 would have been very purposeful. So every artist must create.
That's pretty good. That is rapid fire. Every artist must avoid.
Gosh, something to the effect of every artist must avoid critique when it's too early. Because I think that it's really easy to ask your friend or your mom or your neighbor or your partner and say, hey, what do you think of this that I'm working on? And if their answer is not perfect, it can derail the project before it's finished enough that they can actually get a sense of your intentionality. So I think that avoiding critique before you are at a position to accept it is very important.
Yes. And being selective, perhaps, about. Sure. Oh, this is your round. I agree with that. Every artist must learn.
Not to be a broken record, but I just feel like there's a period at the end of that sentence as well. Like every artist must learn, in the sense that. So I had a drawing teacher, and she said, you guys have to think about this differently. You are never making your masterpiece, because if at any point you make your masterpiece, you're going to have to stop making and just go get a job. So your job is to make the next one better. That's it. As an artist, your job is to make the next piece better forever. And I thought that was such a beautiful thing to say. And I've tried that. And I'm not all, sometimes I make things that are crappier and sometimes I make things that are way better. But the goal being always to make it incrementally better. It could be a tiny increment. Okay, my corners are better on this one piece than the last one, but otherwise it's very much the same. But I am better at a small degree. So I think every artist must learn. I think every artist must press and push, because then if you stop learning, you are not an artist, you are a replicator.
Yeah. Fantastic. I'm really enjoying this. Every artist must remember.
Yeah, well, it depends. So every artist must remember the highs and lows, I think, is a really good one, because as you're talking about sort of building something, there's that middle space that's unglamorous. I think that during that moment, you really need to remember the highs of the goal that you're setting and other experiences that you've had that have led you to the point of doing all of this work. And, remembering the lows of where you came from and other experiences. I think it really can feel so sometimes isolating when you're making something that takes as long as quilts do. And in that isolation, it can be kind of an echo chamber in your brain. And painting's the same. A lot of material explorations are the same. They just take a long time. And so during this arc of long time, your brain is just bouncing whatever thought it is. And sometimes it's a great thought, and sometimes it's a terrible thought. This is the worst thing I've ever made. I'm so embarrassed. Or this is the best thing I've ever made. I wish I'd made this 1,000 times before. And so I think that it's very important for artists to remember the sort of bookends of their ups and downs to help ground them in their forward momentum as they learn and explore and grow.
Yeah, I love that too. I'm trying so hard not to chip in because it is your rapid fire.
I should have written it down and given you the rapid fire afterwards. Yeah.
It's a date. That messy middle, right? And it's an interesting time to talk to you, because I'm so conscious of this project that you are, well, inching closer to completing with the Phoenix installation, that I can only imagine the messy middle of that project. Yeah.
I mean, I've never seen a messy middle quite like this one, where there was a pile of fabric, I mean, as high as me.
Yeah.
Normally my messy middle is more just I need to sweep. But this one in this case was like, there's actually parts of my studio I cannot get to.
Yeah. And if you can even imagine, there was a point in time where you hadn't started making and you were looking at it conceptually, imagining what it might be. And all of that has happened in the process. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Luke, before we say goodbye, I did just want to show one more image. It's a little bit of a surprise. Not one to be worried about, I hope.
It says you. I don't know what it is. We'll see.
But last year, I actually bought one of your small works.
Oh, great. Oh.
And it now hangs in the entrance to my studio. And I wanted to show this today because I think at the moment in the world, perhaps for a lot of people, things feel a bit heavy or uncertain. And so I have this hanging as I go into my studio, but also as I walk past every day. And it actually does work. This idea of an affirmation, something, these words as powerful statements to remember and go by your day with, that I do find myself looking at it and reminding myself of a bigger picture if things are a bit chaotic or, the details of life kind of start getting me bogged down. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to you and Nicole for the Affirmations Project, because I think there is magic in words right now, even more than ever. So I thought I would just throw that in at the end of our chat.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing. That means a lot.
No, that's okay. And I also wanted to say a huge thanks for the conversation. Your responses have been honest and inspiring, and I feel like everything you say is an open door to another conversation. So maybe we'll have to have a part 2 and a part 3.
Oh, please. I would love that. You just tell me when.
Fantastic. So to our audience who are watching and listening, we've come to the end. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with Luke. Don't forget that we'll have the images and Luke's links in our episode description. Luke, is there anything else you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
Oh, you just love to put me on the spot. I have no idea. But outside of thank you, everyone, it's been so fun. And thank you, Joe. This has been such a wonderful conversation. It feels so silly to be interviewed because I have so many questions for you and, you know, the experience. Just, yeah. So thank you for thank you for having me and being kind. And I've just thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, that's great, Luke. Thank you so much. And for everyone watching and listening, we'll say goodbye too. We'll play a little video. Don't forget, you can always catch up on this episode in podcast. So lots of ways to engage with our content and with Luke. So thanks for joining. Bye for now.